facilitators did was ask about future topics. And there's a word cloud from your last meeting. And what I want you to know is that they're responsive people, that we're going to talk about the biggest word on that cloud. And then but it'll mostly be in invisible ink. But there's other things on that word cloud we're going to address too. There's requirements, gathering, and facilitation. We're going to talk about that one out loud. Tools. I definitely hope by the end of the day,
now joining.
We're going to give you a new look at some of the tools that might already be in your toolkit or some tools to add to your toolkit. And then in smaller print, there's requirements confirmation, as well as conflict resolution. And I could point to some more things up here, I think, but that's a healthy sampling to let you know that your Bang facilitators are really trying to listen to your input and trying to bring you things that matter to you. So I want to start us off with the idea that we want to elicit satisfying requirements. And that's a big idea, satisfying requirements, but we're more likely to do that when we do three really important things. And the first thing I'm going to advocate is that you actually use the word requirements much, much less than you might otherwise. That it's far better to talk about needs than to talk about requirements. And I mean that in the literal words, that you should use the word requirements less and use the word need or needs more. In terms of remembering, I'm going to advocate strongly for an issues log that is specialized to the process of elicitation. And I'm going to advocate that we listen for and manage effectively constructive conflict. We've got about 40 minutes, 45 minutes to do that before we go into a longer question and answer session. And so what we're going to ask, if you have a really burning question, I'm more likely to notice it if you say it out loud, but feel free to use the chat window to ask any questions that help you in move the conversation forward. You guys can be conversing with each other as this presentation goes along. My colleagues are going to be cataloging the questions.
Unknown participant is now joining.
If I notice some burning ones, we'll take those on. Use that chat window for anything that's helpful and socially acceptable. A few of you may know me, but my name's Chris Dennis, and I wanted to thank everybody. Most everybody who's here today is a public servant for the state of Oregon, and I want you to know that you're appreciated by me and by all the people of Oregon. I'm a lifelong Oregonian, and I really value this state and all the people that help make it go. I grew up in the farthest eastern Oregon dry side up high on a cattle ranch. And then I escaped and went to the East Coast and got all educated and stuff. I've been in private practice as a consultant since about 2000. And I've got experience in a lot of different organizations, a lot of different, some public sector. I'm doing a lot of work for the city of Portland right now, some in the private sector. I've worked in aircraft manufacturing, I've worked in semiconductors, and I've worked in the nonprofit sector. I did a lot of interesting work a couple of years ago for Mercy Corps. And I think the responding to major disasters is just really educational about what's important in getting things done. Some of you who know me might know me as an instructor at Portland State University. I teach in a number of programs there. I teach in project management, I teach in business analysis, and also in the data analytics program there. And PSU invites you. There's some great courses there. We're going to get right into action. So, action. I'm going to ask, I got a participation poll. You may use your cell phone for that, or you may be able to use a second browser or something of that nature. I'll give you some instructions on how to get there in a minute. It's a question literally about reflection. It's going to ask, what do you do? but it's not going to ask that in a job description-y kind of way. It's really going to try and ask it from the perspective uh, of the actions you take in your life and how they relate to requirements and people's needs. All right. So in a minute, I'm going to show a QR code. If you've got your cell phone with you, you can just take a picture of the QR code. And if you've got a reasonably up-to-date cell phone, it'll take you to the first question in the survey. Or you can use it, do it in your browser. So there's the QR code. And on the left is a URL, menti.com. And and the code, both menti.com and the code will be repeated as soon as I go to the survey. So I'm going to pause here. I'm just going to wait for a whole minute so that people have a chance to get themselves.
Unknown participant is now joining.
And that second screen could be a browser. That second screen could be your phone. Give it a shot. And the question you should see is, how do you see yourself? And you can pick up to 3 items. And you could see yourself as a business analyst or a policy analyst or a systems analyst or a data analyst or a user or an engineer or a project manager. Just think about what you do. You don't have to pick 3. You could pick 1. You could pick up to 3. And as soon as you pick, then we can go over, and I hope that we're beginning to see, oh my gosh, look at that. 40 odd of you have already responded. What I hope you're beginning to see on your screen is something that says poll 1 outcomes. And you should see dots beginning to collect around ideas. The one in the upper left is a little hard to read. It says business analyst. Lots of us are thinking of ourselves in those terms. More responses are coming in. Keep it up, folks. While you're answering and looking at those responses, I am going to see how many people we actually have in with us today. Come on. I love you, Microsoft Teams. We nominally have 86 people in the meeting, and about 60 of us have responded so far. We'll give it a few more minutes. Oh, sweet. We have a database administrator in the house, someone who thinks of themselves in terms of database administration. That's good. We have a few folks who think of themselves as engineers. The reason I asked this question was to try and help me understand the type and the style of thinking and perhaps some of the experiences that people have had and what they bring to the process of elicitation, of bringing forth, of getting people to externalize their needs. I'm going to let it run for 1 more minute and then we'll move on. So the good news is we have a predominance. It's all good.
Is now exiting.
But the fact that many of us present think of ourselves as analysts of one form or another is helpful, because regardless of what your analysts need to bring forth, the need to elicit the needs of their stakeholders, of the people for whom they analyze, whether it's about business or about policy or about data or about systems. We want people to share their needs. And so this today's conversation is going to really aid everybody who thinks of themselves in as doing analysis work. I'm going to go ahead and you can still answer that. If you haven't answered that question yet, you can feel free to answer that question as we go along. And then a little later in the talk, that question will close. But what I want to do is get on a soapbox. And a few people present have taken my requirements analysis course. And I don't literally have a soapbox, but I get up on a soapbox with this idea every time I teach about requirements. So there is some challenge. There is a challenge with thinking about requirements, and it's really in the root word of requirements. It's the word require. And what I want to do is really try and show how that the root word shifts people's thinking based on their perspective, and why that is a serious challenge for anybody who's doing elicitation. So the first place we're going to look at is that user space. You can think of them however you like to think of them: users, customers, business partners. The thing about when you use the word requirements and that word require comes into their consciousness, it's such a problem with the English language. It creates a set of unrealistic expectations, and often people can check out of the process. And the sort of key phrase that goes on in people's mind is on the right-hand side there, that I went to a requirements meeting and I said some stuff out loud, and therefore it's going to happen. And I'm done. My part's done. When those of us who elicit for a living know that talking out loud is really important, and it's just the beginning of a process. But that they went to a requirements meeting, and because things are required in requirements meetings, hooray, I did my part. Compare that to the mind frame of the business analyst or the requirements specialist or database analyst. Put the word analyst in there anywhere. I think the word requirements can put us in a professional bubble. Everything's a requirement. It's just a matter of priority. That we really can, in our minds, treat that word synonymously with the word need, which is a good thing, except that most of our other people we work with don't treat that word in the same way. And then on the solution side, there are some similar challenges where the word requirements, in my mind, leads to digital thinking and people checking out of the process in a way that's equivalent but different, similar but different than what happens with customers, where solutions folks may at times think, oh, well, if it's not a requirement, then we don't have to do it. And anything that's not a requirement isn't important. That they're using the word requirement as a filter to take stuff off their plate as fast as possible. And that's all based on that root word require. And so my practice and my request is that we talk about needs much more than we use the word need much more than the word requirement. So let's take an example. So we got a conversation going. We had the elicitation specialist and we got the stakeholder, and trying on a dialogue. He says, what are your needs in system replacement? And if I were having this dialogue for real, the emphasis I'm putting in the visual field, the bold italics, is really calling our attention to it in this sort of self-conscious conversation. But in the moment when I'm eliciting, I just use the word needs or need, and I don't put any special emphasis on it. So what are your needs in a system replacement? And that invites the stakeholder in a very particular kind of way. Needs? We got a lot of those. There's stuff we got to do to keep our day-to-day operations going. And then we got all these strategic goals, and it allows them to talk about all their needs. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to imagine that our elicitation specialist used the word requirement and began this conversation with the word requirement and said, what are your requirements in a system? What are your requirements in a system replacement? And in my experience, that kind of just using the word puts the stakeholder in a really different frame of mind. And I think that requirements as a word tends to make stakeholders think small when they answer, that we don't necessarily get all their needs, that they hear the word requirement and they're desperate to think of the minimum set instead of a more helpful set of needs. So they'll try to articulate only the smallest things they need, and then when the solution arrives, it provides a relatively small amount of satisfaction. And in my mind, that's a bigger conversation is better, especially when we're eliciting, because eliciting is not the same thing as prioritizing. So let's look at a different kind of example conversation. So we still have an elicitation specialist, but now we've got two stakeholders involved, so a little bit different dynamic. So our elicitation specialist is asking the question of what's needed in this process analysis, what's needed in this process to serve you better. And the thing about the word need is it's a soft word, it's a quiet word, and it allows stakeholders to think about some other words in the sentence. And in this case, the stakeholders are allow themselves to focus on better. Better. What does it mean to think about? Let's think about better for a while. So they're noticing they're more engaged in the improvement part of the conversation and less in the minimum standards part of the conversation. And then she's able in this case to, oh yeah, we compiled a wish list from planning time last year. Compare that if our elicitation specialist had started instead with what are the requirements for this process to serve you better? I think there's a slightly different takeaway here, that the requirements in place of the word needed in this sentence might make the stakeholders think about the constraints of the project more than thinking about the overarching idea of improvement. And especially in elicitation, we want it's an expanding, and we are trying to idealize a better future. And so words that invite people into the conversation of better and bigger thinking are it will result in systems and processes that are more satisfactory in the long run. So we're going to see if we can put some of these ideas together. And what I'm hoping, wait a minute, let me try that again. Good. What I'm hoping is if you go back to your second screen, you should see something that says poll 2 outcomes. And if you, well, no, that's on your primary screen. On your secondary screen, you should see a new question, which is, which of these will get the biggest business insight? So I've put, we're eliciting some needs. We're eliciting about system requirements and about speediness and bandwidth. And then the question is, of the 4 different ways of phrasing that question, which in your opinion, this is about your opinion, will give you the greatest business insight? I'm seeing 47 responses. Things are So we've just about reached the 60 mark, and that's when we'll keep it open. I want to make a few observations based on the results. And remember, you can be adding things in the chat and putting up any
Unknown
questions you
participant
have.
is now exiting.
One of the things I would say is that these conversations, while they may all be about eliciting information about bandwidth, really accomplish very, very different things. And so lots of us are really interested, feel like the greatest business insight's going to come when we ask an open-ended question about how quickly must the data be received, and there's not even, the word bandwidth doesn't even occur. And so a number of things are happening there, right? We're de-emphasizing technical vocabulary
Is now exiting.
and we're asking an open-ended question, as opposed to number one, where number one is actually could be really valuable if you needed to have a fast question with a highly technically competent audience. And it's the kind of question that technically folks who move from technical specialties into analyst specialties start asking from a solutioning perspective, that they know some things about back of house specifications, and so they ask from a specifications perspective instead of a more open-ended perspective.
Hi, Chris. Can you hear me okay?
I can. Go ahead, Jennifer.
We do have a question that was presented to us by Allison. What do you do if everybody just says fast?
Yeah, exactly. Great. And so then, and we'll see, we'll talk a little bit more about this. Jennifer, are you muted? There we go. If everybody says fast, great, because now we have them talking, and now we can talk about the meaning of fast. And we can say, well, what does fast mean to you? Does fast mean you need to see your data today? Does fast mean, like, one question is, what's present from the first question? We can say, can you describe your present performance? And we can shift from fast is a difficult to action, very subjective term, but we can steer the conversation into a less subjective, more actionable venue. So what's your present performance? And we can start talking about is things like, is a minute too slow? Is half a second too slow? Do we need 100 millisecond performance? Those are some questions we might say, or we might take it from a conditions perspective. Like, well, when does, you want it fast, when does fast matter most? And then that's a conversation which can lead us into, there are conditions when speed matters more, and maybe we can purchase bandwidth. We can have a lot of bandwidth at 8 o'clock in the morning when we have many, many customer calls, and we can turn the bandwidth down during the day and make use of options pricing. Who knows? But even the response fast gives us a place to steer the conversation. It's hard to steer the conversation from question number one, for example, because it's a closed-ended question. And thanks, Allison, for the question. I'm going to move us ahead to another question. Oops, I say that, but I have to click in the right place. If you are working on your second screen, you should see a new question come up. If you're looking on your primary screen, we're at poll 3 outcomes. And we have another similar sort of 4-part possibility. So we're asking about making stakeholders comfortable during prioritization. And again, this is an opinion question. Think about your stakeholders We're beginning to see a few responses come across. Lots of people like the boxing approach. At least one person is thinking about the minimalist, a minimal approach, like really getting to the heart of requirements, which is not a wrong thing, So far, though, nobody's buying into which of these requirements are required.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
Yeah. So we're getting close to 60, and you can keep voting for a while if you're in process. That's great. Definitely there's a preponderance in this crowd to let people box their requirements, their needs, and talk about them in a to create reasonable subgroups within those needs. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable approach. I think an interesting conversation is the difference between on your primary screen, the one on the bottom left and the one on the bottom right. There are going to be cases when we're doing elicitation, when we're doing requirements work, where we do need to help people get to a list of important minimums. And it is interesting that in this crowd, the left-hand one of the two on the bottom is seen as helping make the stakeholders most comfortable. Can anybody in the chat or in voice say why they think the left one would make their stakeholders more comfortable? What's the difference between the two on the bottom? Someone in the chat window has said the legislature, and apparently that speaks for itself. I do think so. In the chat window, some people are saying that the giving us advice about don't use the word failure, which is interesting advice. Getting some advice on acceptance criteria. The right one uses the scary word requirements. And when we were talking about needs, it might be less overwhelming. Yeah. So there is a real distinct, in my mind, there's a distinct difference between the left and the right, because one uses the word requirements and one uses the word needs. They both use the word failure. And you can decide whether that's a good word to use or not. I think there are cases where we do need to face what it means to have a project be a failure or be not successful or be viewed in a negative way, and to have that motivate us to put the most we have in our minds on the work. All right, I'm going to move us ahead. I'm going to go into the second sort of major piece that I wanted to talk about today, which is keeping an issues log that really focuses on the elicitation process. So one question is, how is an elicitor's choose your word, an elicitor's issues log different than any other issues log? Well, first let's talk about the overarching concept of an issues log. At its very base, creation, and issues log is a list of stuff that isn't right enough yet. And then we tag a bunch of metadata on it, right? So we start making this list, and we might associate identifiers with everything in the list and details about which aspect of our larger challenge these issues address and what kinds of impact they have and so on. We can be pretty, the amount of metadata can be substantial. And then we would also carry some details in the metadata about resolution of those issues. So that's an issues log in general. And I would say that an elicitor's issues log is really quite different from, at least I think mine is, when I'm in project management mode versus when I'm in eliciting mode. That those are, I keep really different issues logs for those. An elicitor's issues log it's what isn't right enough in the elicitation process. We're really trying to get people to externalize their needs, and that's a really socially dynamic process. It's often more about connecting with people and sort of completing areas of investigation, and it's also about it also can in a programmer's issues log and a solution architect's issues log, there are often many black and white issues. Is it resolved or is it not resolved? In an elicitor's issues log, there's a lot of more ambiguity in resolution, and that's something to really recognize. So you might, in your elicitor's log, talk about missing stakeholder input, but it's hard to know for sure if you've got it all. Similarly, there can be conflicting needs. That's a really common thing to have in an elicitation log, issues log. We might wonder out loud if we're missing or there are non-existent artifacts or documentation we should be analyzing as part of our elicitation. And sometimes it's really clear those things are missing. Like somebody said, "Oh, I know that exists, and we don't have it." Or you just feel it in your bones like somebody wrote this down sometime and it's somewhere in this organization and I just haven't asked the right question or I'm not talking to the right person, and you're trying to move that more ambiguous issue forward. Often there are communications problems that we need to document, and resolution of communication issues there are many possible resolutions. And of course, there can be needs, requirements, which need work. They could be ambiguous, they can be incomplete, unverified or unverifiable. So that's the nature of the data and the metadata, I think, is a little different. It's still a list of what isn't right enough yet, and it has a different character. So on your primary screen, we're at poll 4. And what we've done is we've put up some common elicitation issues, and we're asking you to divide 100 points between those elicitation issues. And I want to say for sure that you don't have to have experienced every one of these issues. You could give 0 points to some of the issues. On your secondary screen, you should be seeing that question. And if you're on a small screen like a phone, you'll have to scroll up and down to see all the list of elicitation issues we've listed. The first person has responded. You can see how they put their elicitation, their issues. We're starting to get a few more.
Janelle Krupp
Is now exiting.
I appreciate. that some people here today have elicitations that are issue-free. My joy is with you, people. My joy is with you. We have a close tie for third and fourth right now, with conflicting needs and communication problems. It does seem to be kind of a neck and neck for 2, 3, and 4. I like that our professional goal, people, ought to be to move my elicitations are issue-free farther up in the mix. If we succeed, if today's talk is successful, people will have fewer issues in their elicitations. Right. Yes, the roughly equal nature of conflicting needs, stakeholders designing solutions before exploring their needs, and communication problems as roughly equal is quite an interesting result, as is the rough equity of instability of preferences and a lack of access to users and stakeholders. Sometimes in larger organizations, lack of access comes up higher on this list. And it's also interesting that undocumented processes play such a strong role in this group, as it is often smaller organizations that have the challenge of undocumented processes. Young, small organizations are often challenged in that regard. I'm going to go ahead and move us on. Thank you for that. I know that our facilitators today are really interested in the outcome of this question, as looking for some potential future assistance in about our real issues. So thank you. So when we think about an elicitation log for elicitors, there's really two ways to go, more or less, standalone and integrated. So the standalone issues log is probably one that you've all had some experience with a time or two in your life, that you've got a requirements repository, a place where the needs as expressed are living and cataloged and sorted and prioritized and all that. And then off to the side, there's an elicitation issues log. And that could be an Excel or a Word file. It could be in Smartsheets. It could be a whole fancy database. But there's some inherence of, there's some idea of separateness of those systems, that the requirements live over there and the issues live over here. And one of the reasons those things exist is because it's really easy to set up. That there may be existing process around how we store our requirements, but not so much about how we store our issues. So people just make stuff up. And my experience is that over the long run, these are the standalone version is more labor intensive. Compare that to an integrated issues log, where the requirements repository and elicitation issues log are almost indistinguishable. The setup of that kind of a system can be labor intensive, or not if you buy the right requirements repository. Some of them now are built in. But my personal experience is that the integrated version fundamentally leads to faster resolution of issues that you identify as an elicitor. And the other thing that can be really great is because of partially because of just gains in accessibility, but partially because of the integration, stakeholders can play a greater role in the actual resolution of issues than in the standalone case. So your stakeholders may or may not be able to reach your requirements repository, but when in the standalone case, it's very often they can't see your elicitation log because it just tends to be more private to the elicitation team. In the integrated case, you can extend the requirements and the issues at the same time. I'm going to show an example of one that I'm using in my practice right now with a small consulting firm that I work with. And this happens to be implemented in Airtable. It's not the only game in town. I just want to show you how something like this works and what it can do for you as an elicitor. So it's a little bit behind the title, but in the left section here is just a running list of all the requirements, all the needs that we've gathered for this particular process or for this particular system. And they're individually numbered, and you can see they've got some other metadata associated with them. In this large open window here, we're looking at the detail of one need, one requirement. And so the repository database has got both needs and sources, so we can do some traceability. And then it's got requirement detail. Up here is the requirements text, and it tells you when the requirement got made, and it tells you the description of the associated with the requirement. So that's all about metadata for the requirement. And this particular requirement doesn't have one because we were near the end of this project, but we can put the requirements in front of stakeholders and they can comment and edit them in real time. So they can say what isn't right enough and they can make it righter in their words. And that's a really powerful thing that can save elicitors a lot of time and a lot of conversational headache. And we can talk about the status of the requirement, so it's really obvious if it has an issue associated with it. And then on the right side is essentially a change log from the requirement. You're seeing what got added, you're seeing what got subtracted, you're seeing who it got assigned to, and you're seeing who made the change. And I'm just going to pause. I know some things have been coming up in the chat. Jennifer, is there anything that you want me to pay particular attention to in the moment?
No, I don't think so. I think we're okay.
Okay, great. So that's all I'm going to say for the moment on on the subject of issues logs for elicitation. The last thing I really want to talk about is constructive conflict. And I want all of us to have a better ear for for identifying constructive conflict and then working with it. So here's the best visual I know to talk about conflict, that we are looking at exactly the same thing, and two different stakeholders have different interpretations of reality. And so then we can talk about the nature of conflict and then delve into what constructive conflict. So conflict in its essence is a clash of interests where there are contradictory perspectives on an issue or facts. And at the heart of that is some kind of disagreement. In our little picture, somebody thought it was a 6 and another person thought it was a 9. And if you're looking at it, you could also say it was a G. And that's disagreement. And at one level, people can accept that. It's when discord arises that many stakeholders and elicitors kind of want to back away because discord is not a comfortable place. All right, that's conflict in general. Talk about constructive conflict. There's a couple key elements to help us recognize constructive conflict. The first of those is that at least one stakeholder, hopefully more, are not cemented in place, that they have an openness to resolution, and that there's some sort of curiosity or and respect about the contradictory perspectives or the alternative interests that are present. You can then, that plays at a lot of different levels. So when there's constructive conflict, when there's some openness and some curiosity and some respect, there's a number of ways that things can shift for the better. And the minimum of those is just greater and shared understanding. The thing about eliciting needs, about eliciting requirements, is we're working together to create a solution which will serve many. And therefore, shared understanding is of itself a thing to value. So if all that happens is people understand each other better, that's a win, and you did a good job in A, eliciting, and B, managing constructive conflict. But you might also help people get to new positions, and that is a fantastic outcome, especially in elicitation work. Okay. So there are a number of conflict behaviors, and I'm going to use a particular classification system. There's a lot of work done on conflict out there, but these I think are really helpful for differentiating things that are constructive leaning, things you can try and sense to see if they're present. So there's an idea of what's called a collaborative response to construction, where people are interested in finding some solution that's mutually satisfaction. So call that collaborative. And then there's compromising, where people are willing to give something up. So there's giving something up isn't full satisfaction, right? You're not getting everything you want. Those two are really different. Mutually satisfactory and giving something up are different, but in my mind, they're both they're behaviors which are indicative of constructive conflict, which are, if people are displaying these behaviors, then they're leaning towards a constructive conflict model. Differentiate that from some other behaviors, which I think are leaning away. There can be sometimes there can be competitive conflict behaviors where people are interested only in their personal goals. People can avoid conflict. That's another thing that I think leans away from a constructive situation. And then there's what I would call accommodating behavior, which people can misconstrue as being constructive, but people essentially are willing to just walk away and give up everything they care about in order to
Unknown participant is now
to deal
exiting.
with the conflict. So my ask is that you listen for these in your stakeholders, the things that are constructive leaning and the things that are leaning away from constructive, so that you can see the situation and then potentially steer it. And not only should you listen for this in your stakeholders, but you should listen for it if you're on an elicitation team, because elicitors can also show these behaviors and lean away from constructive conflict. Let's look at an example pretty quickly. So one of this, we got two stakeholders here, and you're listening in on their conversation. This is elicitation free for a minute. We're just talking about constructive conflict. So one of them says, well, we got to get our data to our staff in the field through their phones. We got to do it. That's important to me. And the other person's like, security expert, our data shouldn't be extended outside of the security boundary. Okay. What I hope is that you sense the conflict there. Question: is this constructive conflict or not yet constructive conflict? You can think about that, and let's let the conversation play out one piece of dialogue further, where one of the stakeholders says to the person they're in conflict with, why not? So when there are only two phrases in the air, we recognize this as conflict and it is not clear if this is a constructive conflict situation or something else. But that's the indicator of curiosity. The why can't we put our stuff outside why can't we put our data outside the security boundary? To me, that's an indicator, as an elicitor, that's an indicator to me that there's an opening here. Curiosity is the signal of an opening, and we can make use of that. So now let's put the elicitor in the equation. So we got a three-way conversation. So the elicitor asks, do we have to convert all the data? We're doing a system implementation. We're doing an upgrade. Do we have to convert all the data? Stakeholder 1, absolutely. Stakeholder 2, our data is filthy. We should trash it. We should trash all but the last fiscal year. All right, so we have conflict. Is this constructive conflict or not? Well, that's a good question. So far, I don't think it is. Let's let the dialogue play a little bit more. We do have some bad records, but we need it all. So this person's doing something important right here in this last phrase. So they've taken a position, there's a contradictory position, they're reinforcing their position. We do have some bad record. I'm sorry, they're admitting the person's point that our data is not perfect, and then they're reinforcing their position. So there's an acknowledgement of the other person's position, and to me, that's an indicator that there's a possibility for constructive conflict. And so then as an elicitor, what you can do is insert a question that allows both sides to talk. In this case, the words I put in the elicitor's mouth are, what's valuable about the historic data, and how do we use it? And that question gets both to a length of time and the importance of the data itself, and to see if the use requires a lot of history or a little history. And my takeaway for you is that any kind of agreement is a signal of the potential for constructive conflict. And then a really good technique is to invite them to talk to each other. And that avoiding closed-ended questions is a good idea. So as we come towards the end of our time together, I want to give you just a couple of tools, things you can do once you sense constructive conflict. So as a general practice for managing conflict, first of all, identify that there is conflict. We got a conflict here. And then conflict analysis can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different practitioners. One of the things I'm personally asking you to do is to understand in this conflict analysis if you think you have the possibility of constructive conflict, and to steer towards constructive conflict. We're going to move that forward, and then, oh my gosh, we're going to make sure we document it. And the more the conflicted parties are involved in the documentation of the resolution, the better. That's a good general practice. In constructive conflict, for listeners, I encourage questions where they're asking each other questions. So and it doesn't have to be two parties, it can be multiple parties. But however many parties are in conflict, the more they're asking themselves questions and exploring each other's positions, that's good. If you have to inject a question, great, that's okay. But try to inject a question that both sides get to answer from their perspectives. And then, by gosh, you should invite clarification. Can you say more about that? Is a surprisingly effective way to move conflict forward. Another option for a a situation where constructive conflict exists is to create a set of scenarios and have people talk out loud about the scenario. So if you've worked with designers of any stripe, they call that combinational play. Some people call it making pizza. There's a number of ways they talk about it, but the combinatorial play is the idea of just putting up a bunch of different possibilities and then exploring A, the issues of the conflict, and B, to see if there is actually an outcome that might be satisfactory. And then a final thing that you might do is it's okay to go away from the conflict for a while. If you mutually all make the decision to go on to other issues and come back to the conflict, make sure that you as an elicitor, as a facilitator, mark the expectation that we're going to resolve this thing. We're not running away. We're taking a rest. We're going to come back and we're going to go somewhere. Where somewhere is resolution. So here's our last poll before we finish for the day, and you can rank each of these conflicts on a scale of ease of resolution and value of resolution. And on your big screen, on your main screen, you should say poll 5. On your secondary screen, you should see the questions, and the options are at a more legible size than they are on the big screen. And you're ranking those on a scale of 1 to 4. 1 being low effort, 4 being high effort, 1 being low value, 4 being high value. We got some early inputs. Excellent. Thank you, number 1. Whoever number 1 was, congratulations and thank you. Rumor has it there's more than one of us here. We still have 73 people on the docket. That's awesome. And so what you're seeing is the dots moving around is the impact of people, their vote weighting the position of those issues in the spectrum of effort to resolve. And you know, different elicitors are skilled at resolving different kinds of conflicts, and that's okay. One of the things that can be a really helpful approach is if you're eliciting and you find a sort of a sizable place where people are stuck, you know, you can call in a colleague who is better at resolving that a particular kind of conflict. And we've been focusing on constructive conflict, but there are some other kinds of conflicts which are less than constructive, and there are techniques for resolving those as well.
Unknown participant is now exiting.
I love you, unknown participant. It is interesting that we feel like scheduling and the unknown scheduling with a subject matter when we're blocked from scheduling has the highest value in this group. And I appreciate that database nomenclature is not the highest value. So we're in a pretty stable spot. I want to conclude our time together with some of the major themes from today's work. So elicitation is really, really important work. Everybody's work life is aided when we create satisfying sets of requirements. And there are some things we can do to make that job easier and more satisfying. I really strongly suggest that you get the word requirements out of your vocabulary when you're eliciting.
Lori,
Talk
can you-
about needs,
Is
not
now exiting.
keep an issues log that is really focused on the elicitation process, and be tuned for constructive conflict, and increasingly, take actions to resolve constructive conflict. We're going to open it up for more questions, and you can ask your questions verbally if you want. I've got some, I'm free to take some questions for some time. Leaving you with a final thought, there's a worldwide group of business analysts, and I love their definition of what a requirement is, that it's a usable representation of a need. I think that's an incredibly actionable, true, and helpful definition of what a requirement is. We're open for questions, people. Are there some? We're here at your service.
I don't think we have any right now, Christopher, but I do really want to go ahead without having technical difficulties. Thank you so much for your time today and for being here and being willing to participate with this incredible group of professionals.
Yeah, you're welcome. And I want to thank everybody again for keeping Oregon green, and a lot of other things that we do to help our state. So thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it.
Just
Yeah.
to let everybody know, Christopher has agreed to let us share his slide deck. So in our wrap-up email, you will receive the information from today's meeting as well. So
Right on.
appreciate that. So. All right. If you guys don't have any questions for Christopher, our next meeting is in August. On the 27th, so we'll be sending out more information, and it appears like based on the emails we received this afternoon, it'll probably be another virtual forum, so another opportunity for us to get our technical difficulties squared away. We appreciate your patience and your attendance. This is an important group. We have a question.
We have a question. Huzzah!
Yeah.
Oh.
Is now exiting.
Samantha would like to know how you should handle stakeholders who are notorious for scope creep.
Oh, Samantha, my heart goes out to you. First of all, let me say with a raised eyebrow that I've never met a stakeholder who is notorious for scope creep. Okay, I have. Seriously. So let me say, this is an open question, and anybody who's still here should feel free to help answer Samantha's really important question. Okay. I think so here's some good news. If people are notorious for scope creep, it means that we can be proactive. It means that we can think about them as stakeholders and as people. So both in their business context, in their day-to-day work context, and other drivers that may make them notorious for scope creep. So some people are notorious for scope creep for, like, I'm just going to say some stuff. Some people are notorious for scope creep because they're greedy. They want more. They want
Is
more.
now exiting.
Other people are notorious for scope creep because they're very, very agile. well, what was true this week is not true next week, and not true the week after that, and not true the week after that. And that's a different kind of scope. That's a different root cause for scope creep. And so one recommendation I have is see if you can understand some of the root causes for their notoriety, for their notoriousness, because that may be able, if people are notorious for scope creep because they're in a very fast changing environment, then maybe what we need to do is shift into an agile mode. So where what we do is we only ask for requirements once an iteration, and we fulfill those requirements, and we just honor the need for shift. Like I've made that shift personally in the last month with a client where we were doing some process improvement work, and the frank truth is that COVID-19, the situation's evolving so fast, the requirements aren't stable, and great, we have a way of dealing. It's not great, it's not fun, but well, it's kind of fun. What we have is a method for dealing with that. So that's one example. And now let's take a completely different example where some people are notorious for scope creep because it is an exercise of their personal power. That happens sometimes. A really interesting question is, what can we do in that case? And I think a really good thing to do is to ask yourself and ask others, and then ask them about how their personal power is increased by keeping the scope stable. And that self-interest, there's two things. One, identifying that their self-interest might be best served with stable requirements, best served by keeping the scope stable, is a step. And then the other step is to ask permission to highlight their notorious behavior if their notorious behavior shows up. So let me say that in a slightly different way to paint the picture. Sometimes stakeholders are notorious for scope creep because it is an exercise of personal power. If that's the case, people value their personal power. And we might be able to shift the behavior if we can recognize that keeping the scope stable enhances their personal power. They'll get more credit. They'll be seen as a greater supporter. They will be, and then you can add on to that list. And so the conversation would go something like this: hey, you're notorious for being a scope creeper. And I think that your personal what do I want to say? Your personal credibility and value and how you're seen by others will go up if we keep the scope stable. And if they're open to that conversation and they can hear that, and they're like, wow, really? That's great. I would like more personal power. I would like to be even more noted, right? Notoriousness, the root word is notoriety, and they want recognition. I could get even more recognition if we keep the scope stable. Great. I hear you want to keep the scope stable. And you've got lots of years of practice in changing the scope. So do I have permission to help you notice when you're changing the scope? That's not an easy series of conversations to have, but I can say that can work. I have definitely implemented that. And what I've tried to do is give you two different sort of spectrums of why people may be notorious. And now I'm going to look at the question. Is that helpful, Samantha? What do you think? And Mike's given us some advice too. And Amanda Allen's got a question. I want to see more of Mike's. See if there was a question on the end of his. Yeah, that's a great piece of advice, Mike. And then Amanda Allen's got a question for us. What's a good strategy for turning non-constructive conflict into constructive conflict? Sweet question. Really, really lovely question. All right. How do we turn non-constructive conflict into constructive conflict? So first of all, let me congratulate you and admire you for having the energy to ask that question and be involved in those conversations. That's awesome. We won't always succeed, but we can be really proud of trying. Now, to answer the question, what's a good strategy for doing that? I'm going to go back a little bit in the slides, and what you should be seeing in front of you, if you still have a screen up, is what should I do once I sense constructive conflict? And mentally, I want you to change the word constructive to unconstructive. And sometimes the last item on this list is a strategy that can work. So as an elicitor, you can recognize an unproductive conflict and say, okay, this looks unproductive right now, pause. And maybe you want to mark, so at the bottom of this, I said, mark the resolution of expectation, mark the resolution expectation. You may, when you have an unproductive conflict, you may want to do that, and you may not want to do that. Different conflict resolution professionals will do different stuff there depending on the stakeholders. But the pause can be really powerful. And here's a strategy to have in the pause. The strategy to have in the pause, if you're willing to do it, is to take on some constructive approaches in isolation. So if we take a pause, then we have the opportunity to separate the conflicting parties. And it's actually maybe easier to shift them into a constructive way when they are not looking at each other, not talking to each other, not at their highest emotional level. And so an option is, once you separate them, then you could ask a rhetorical question to the parties separately, like, wow, I hear that you're really kind of standing in concrete. Are you really standing in concrete? And if so, can you tell me more about the concrete? Can you tell me why you feel like you're standing in concrete? Why your position is immobile? Why you're trapped in this position? And I'm choosing a word there, and you might not want to choose the same word. But if people feel trapped, I'm doing a little emotional manipulation there. If you feel, people don't want to feel trapped. I'm trapped. Whoa, I need to get out of here. I'm trapped. Well, if they by getting out means getting out of the position they're locked into. And if they can get out in the direction towards another party, that's an opportunity. And now you go repeat that process with the other party. And it could be, one thing we might discover is that there are real issues there that they can't get out of, and sometimes that's true. But often people are not as poured in concrete as they might first appear. So I hope that's helpful. Yeah, a couple other comments came in. Winnie says, acknowledge the unconstructive criticism. Yep, that's a good thought. So Winnie's giving us a thought about some other ways to take on non-constructive conflict acknowledgement. Yeah, Joseph Donahue is also giving us another opportunity. Like they could be, the conflict can be at each other, but people actually may be able to shift positions if they're moving towards a greater goal. That's great advice. Yeah, super. I wish everybody who's here the best. I can't emphasize enough how valuable and I think unsung good elicitation work is. It's a wonderful combination of human interaction, technical knowledge, um, writerly skill. All of those things just have such great value. It brings together so many great aspects of being alive. Give it a shot. Thanks everybody. Oh, we got some more. Let's see, Miss Stephanie Solomon got a comment for us. Yeah, Allison, you're welcome. Sweet. So I hear Stephanie Solomon giving us some insight on a way of sort of identifying when things are in conflict with processes or you can have I'll leave it at that, deviations from processes and highlighting the impact of non-conforming behavior or conflicting behavior. Yeah, that's cool. And then Susan's got one about creating a learning and collaboration environment. Yeah, that's fantastic. Yeah, I think Susan's giving us a really important observation. And if I can say it in slightly different words, the idea when sometimes when people are in conflict, they are seeking something they do not have and need. And it can be about, and it may be not at all about the subject at hand. And I think an interesting question in non-productive conflict is, what's the real need? And is there a way to give what's needed and thereby alleviate the need that's driving non-productive conflict? Trying to think if I have a short example of that. I have some long examples of that. Well, I think this behavior often can be really clear with young children, but I think it also plays out in adults. Sometimes young children will get in non-productive conflicts about trivial stuff because they're hungry or because they're tired or because, and you can make up, and you don't have to make it up, there are just some underlying biological needs that people have, and sometimes they're subtle, but with kids it can be really obvious. Like we're having this argument not because the argument is substantial, but because this person needs to sleep. And if you can provide an environment where the sleep is, and they can have the sleep, and then the non-productive conflict goes away or is reduced. That's the simplest, most obvious example, and I think similar strategies play out in more sophisticated adult conflicts. And that's my interpretation of what Susan is saying. 421.
Thanks, Christopher.
You are most welcome. Well, I think I'll step away unless there are more questions. Can I just say, for anybody who's still here, it has been an honor to serve you today. Please, please, please have a fabulous evening. I wish you all good health, and I wish you all a great summertime. Take care.
Thank you, Chris.
Bye-bye.
All right, thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll give you back about 5 minutes of your day. You should be receiving a newsletter from our work group next month, and if you have not signed up for our listserv, you can always email va.network@oregon.gov, and we can send you the links on how to get signed up for that, and also to find more information on our website. But you will be receiving more information, including the slide deck from Christopher later this week. So thank you all for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you in a couple of months, even if it is virtually.
Multiple people are now exiting.